The restaurant was known as one of the most beautiful places in the city. People came there to celebrate promotions, anniversaries, and business deals. The lights were soft and golden, hanging from crystal chandeliers that sparkled above every table. The floor shined like glass, and every plate, fork, and wine glass was placed perfectly. Even the air smelled expensive, filled with the scent of fresh flowers and warm bread. On this particular evening, the restaurant was especially busy. A wealthy man sat at one of the best tables near the center of the room. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and a watch that caught the light every time he lifted his hand. His voice carried across the room as he spoke to the three guests sitting with him. They laughed loudly at his jokes, leaning in as he told stories about big deals and expensive vacations. He enjoyed being the center of attention. To him, this dinner was not just a meal. It was a chance to impress. The guests were important business partners, and he wanted them to see his success. He ordered the most expensive dishes without even looking at the prices. He asked for rare wine and made sure everyone around him could hear how much it cost. A young waitress was assigned to his table that night. She had tied her hair neatly behind her head and wore a clean black uniform with a small white apron. Her posture was straight, and her smile was polite but calm. She had worked at the restaurant for almost a year and knew how to handle difficult customers. Still, she felt a small knot in her stomach when she saw which table she had been given. She approached with a steady step and greeted them warmly. Her voice was soft but clear. She handed out menus and asked if they would like something to drink first. The wealthy man barely looked at her. He continued talking as if she were invisible. After a few seconds, he glanced up and gave her a quick nod. "Bring us your most expensive red wine," he said, then smirked at his guests. "Let's see if she can pronounce it correctly." The guests chuckled. The waitress kept her smile. She nodded and walked to the bar to get the bottle. She knew the wine he had chosen. It had a long French name that was not easy to say. She had practiced it before, but she still felt nervous. When she returned, she carefully placed the bottle on the table and began to pronounce the name. She stumbled slightly over one word. It was only a small mistake, barely noticeable. But the wealthy man caught it immediately. He leaned back in his chair and laughed loudly. "That's not how you say it," he said, shaking his head. "If you're going to work in a place like this, you should at least learn the basics." One of the guests joined in. "Maybe they don't teach that in waitress school," he joked. The table burst into laughter. A few nearby diners glanced over. The waitress felt her cheeks grow warm, but she did not react. She simply apologized in a calm voice and repeated the name correctly this time. Then she opened the bottle and poured the wine with steady hands. Inside, though, she felt the sting of embarrassment. It was not the first time someone had looked down on her because of her job. Still, it never felt good. The wealthy man watched her closely, almost searching for another mistake. "So," he said casually, "is this your full-time career? Or are you planning something bigger?" His tone made it clear he did not believe there could be anything bigger. She answered honestly, "I'm working here for now, sir." "For now," he repeated with a small laugh. "Well, aim high. Maybe one day you'll upgrade from carrying plates to owning one." The guests smiled politely, unsure whether to laugh again. The waitress gave a small nod and stepped away from the table. She could feel their eyes on her back as she walked toward the kitchen. Once she was out of sight, she allowed herself a slow breath. In the corner of the restaurant stood a grand piano. It was polished black with its lid slightly raised. On most weekends, a hired musician would play soft music while guests ate. But tonight, there was no performer scheduled. The piano sat quietly, almost forgotten. As the waitress passed it, her eyes rested on it for just a second longer than usual. She had not touched those keys in months. Back at the wealthy man's table, the mood grew louder. The wine had been poured, and the jokes continued. The man spoke about hard work and success, about how some people rise to the top while others stay at the bottom. He did not lower his voice when he said those words. "It's all about talent," he said proudly. "If you've got it, you make it. If you don't, well..." He shrugged and took a sip of wine. One of the guests glanced toward the kitchen where the waitress had gone. Something about the way she carried herself did not match the picture he had painted. But he stayed silent. The waitress returned with their appetizers, placing each plate carefully in front of the right person. She described the dishes clearly and politely. This time, she pronounced every word perfectly. Still, the wealthy man found something else to comment on. "Careful," he said when she set down his plate. "That looks heavier than you." She forced a small smile. "I can manage, sir." "Good," he replied, "because dropping it would cost more than your weekly pay." The guests laughed again, though more softly now. The waitress walked away once more. Her steps were controlled, but her heart felt heavy. She was used to long shifts and tired feet. She was used to rushing between tables. But nights like this tested something deeper. She had once dreamed of something very different. There was a time when her evenings were filled with music instead of noise. When her hands moved across piano keys instead of carrying plates. When people listened to her not because they wanted service, but because they wanted to hear her play. Life, however, had changed quickly. Family responsibilities had come first. Bills had to be paid. Dreams were placed on hold. She shook those thoughts away and focused on her work. At the wealthy man's table, the conversation turned toward education. He spoke proudly about elite schools and private tutors. "Education separates people," he said confidently. "You can always tell who has it and who doesn't." His eyes briefly flicked toward the waitress as she refilled a glass of water. "Where did you study?" One of the guests suddenly asked her, perhaps out of curiosity rather than mockery. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I studied music," she said simply. The wealthy man raised an eyebrow. "Music," he repeated. "And now you're serving tables? That must have worked out well." The table grew quiet for a moment. She kept her voice steady. "Sometimes life changes plans." "That's one way to put it," he replied with a smirk. She stepped away again, but this time a few more diners had noticed the exchange. The air in the restaurant felt slightly different now. The laughter at that table no longer sounded harmless. It sounded sharp. Near the bar, another server whispered, "Are you okay?" She nodded. "I'm fine," and she meant it. She was stronger than she looked. Back at the table, the wealthy man continued enjoying his role as entertainer. He did not notice that some of his guests had grown quieter. He did not see the subtle shift in their expressions. He only saw a waitress. What he did not see was the discipline behind her calm posture. The years of practice. The early mornings and late nights spent perfecting pieces that required patience and heart. He did not see the sacrifices she had made or the strength it took to keep smiling in moments like this. As she cleared their appetizer plates, his voice rang out once more. "Maybe after dinner," he joked loudly, "you can give us a little music lesson." He gestured casually toward the grand piano in the corner. The guests chuckled, unsure whether he was serious. The waitress followed his gesture with her eyes. For a brief second, something flickered in her expression. Not anger, not shame, something else. She lowered her gaze politely and said, "Enjoy your meal, sir." Then she walked away, leaving the table in a wave of uneasy laughter. The piano remained silent in the corner, waiting. The dinner continued, but something in the air had changed. The laughter at the wealthy man's table did not sound as natural as before. It felt forced now, like his guests were laughing because they felt they had to, not because they truly found him funny. The waitress stayed focused on her work. She moved between tables with care, checking on other guests, bringing out fresh dishes, and keeping her posture straight. But even as she worked, she could feel his eyes following her. He was waiting for another chance to make a comment. When the main course arrived, she carried the plates carefully, one by one. The dishes were heavy and arranged with delicate detail. She placed each plate down gently, making sure everything looked perfect. The wealthy man examined his food closely. "Let's hope this tastes better than the wine pronunciation," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. A few people looked up from their meals. The waitress kept her expression calm. "If there's anything you need, please let me know," she replied politely. He leaned back in his chair. Actually, there is something. Tell me, when you studied music, did you really think that would pay the bills? The question was not asked with kindness. It was asked to entertain his table. She paused for a brief second. I believed in it, she said quietly. Belief doesn't always mean success, he answered quickly. The world is competitive. Only the best make it. One of his guests shifted in his seat. Everyone has their own path, the guest said carefully. The wealthy man waved his hand dismissively. Of course, some paths just lead to serving food. The words landed heavily. The waitress felt the sting again, but she refused to let it show. She had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. She simply nodded and stepped away. In the kitchen, she stood still for a moment near the counter. The noise of plates clinking and chefs calling out orders filled the space, but she barely heard it. Her thoughts drifted back to a small room with a piano by a window. She remembered practicing for hours until her fingers ached. She remembered her teacher telling her she had rare talent. She remembered the day she had to pack up her music sheets and leave that life behind. A fellow server touched her arm gently. You don't have to take that, the server whispered. She gave a small smile. It's okay. I've heard worse. And it was true. Life had already tested her in bigger ways than a rude customer. Back in the dining area, the wealthy man continued telling stories about his rise to success. He spoke about starting with nothing and building everything through hard work. But as he spoke, he kept making small remarks about the waitress whenever she passed by. That's why you need ambition, he said loudly at one point. Otherwise, you end up stuck. The guests exchanged looks. One of them finally asked, Did you ever fail at anything? The wealthy man laughed. Fail? Not really. I learned early how to win. His confidence filled the room, but it was no longer impressive. Felt heavy. When the waitress returned to refill their glasses, one of the guests asked her softly, What kind of music did you study? She looked at him, surprised by the gentle tone. Classical piano, she replied. That's not easy, the guest said. Before she could answer, the wealthy man interrupted. Classical piano? He let out a short laugh. That explains the dramatic expression earlier. The table grew quiet again. Do you still play? The guest asked her, ignoring the comment. She hesitated. Not much anymore. Why not? She glanced down briefly. Life became busy. The wealthy man smirked. Busy carrying plates, I suppose. This time, the laughter did not come. A woman sitting at a nearby table frowned slightly. She had been listening without meaning to. Others were listening too now. The mocking tone was no longer entertainment. Felt uncomfortable. The waitress straightened her shoulders. Excuse me, she said politely, and walked away again. At the far end of the restaurant, the grand piano remained still. The soft lighting reflected off its smooth surface. It almost seemed out of place in the middle of the tension. As the night went on, the wealthy man ordered dessert for everyone. Only the best, he insisted. We're celebrating success. When the waitress brought the desserts, he suddenly looked toward the piano again. You know, he said with a grin, since you studied music, maybe you should give us a little show after this. Some guests looked surprised. He continued, It would make this dinner more interesting. The suggestion was not kind. It was a challenge, wrapped in sarcasm. The waitress felt every eye in the area shift toward her. For a moment, the room felt smaller. We don't have a performer tonight, one of the guests said lightly, trying to ease the tension. Exactly, the wealthy man replied. She can fill in. Unless that education was just a hobby. The words were sharp, but he delivered them with a smile. The manager, who had been watching from a distance, stepped closer. Is there a problem here? He asked calmly. No problem, the wealthy man said. We're just discussing hidden talents. The manager looked at the waitress, silently asking if she was okay. She nodded slowly. Inside her, something was changing. The embarrassment was fading. In its place was a quiet determination. She was tired of being reduced to a uniform and an apron. tired of being measured by someone else's idea of success. She thought about the nights she had stayed awake practicing difficult pieces. She thought about the sacrifices her family had made. She thought about how much music still lived inside her, even if she had not touched the keys in months. The wealthy man leaned forward. "So, can you actually play? Or was that just a story?" His voice was softer now, but it carried across the silent space. The waitress looked toward the piano again. Her heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from memory. "I can play," she said simply. There was no anger in her tone, only truth. The wealthy man raised his eyebrows. "Well then," he said, spreading his hands as if presenting a stage. "Why not prove it?" A few guests shifted uncomfortably. One whispered, "That's not necessary." But the moment had already taken hold of the room. The manager spoke gently. "You don't have to do this." She looked at him and gave a small, steady smile. "It's okay," she said. She untied her apron slowly and placed it neatly on the service counter. The simple action felt bigger than it looked. Conversations at other tables began to fade as people noticed what was happening. The wealthy man leaned back in his chair again, confident that this would end in another laugh. The waitress walked toward the piano with calm steps. Each step felt like moving closer to a part of herself she had kept hidden for too long. As she reached the bench, she paused for just a second. The room was almost completely quiet now. Even the clinking of dishes had stopped. Behind her, the wealthy man folded his arms, waiting. She sat down slowly. Her fingers hovered above the keys, not touching them yet. She took one deep breath. In that moment, she was no longer thinking about the insults. She was not thinking about the expensive suits or the mocking smiles. She was thinking about music, about sound, about the feeling of letting her hands speak when words were not enough. The piano waited under her fingertips, and the entire restaurant waited with it. Her fingers rested lightly on the piano keys, but she did not press them yet. The room felt different now. Just minutes ago, it was filled with loud laughter and the sound of dishes clinking. Now it was so quiet that even the soft hum of the air conditioner could be heard. She closed her eyes for a brief second. She remembered the first time she ever touched a piano. She had been small, barely tall enough to reach the keys without standing on her toes. The sound had surprised her. One simple note had filled the whole room. From that day, music had become more than a hobby. It had become her voice. She opened her eyes and gently pressed the first key. The note rang out, clear and soft. A second note followed. Then a third. The sound slowly grew into a melody, smooth and careful at first. Her hands moved with control, though she had not practiced in months. The memory lived in her fingers. It had never truly left. At the wealthy man's table, the smirk on his face began to fade. He had expected something awkward. He had expected a mistake. Instead, what he heard was calm and beautiful. The guests looked at one another. The melody began to build. Her left hand created a steady rhythm while her right hand danced across the higher keys. The notes blended together like a story being told without words. It was gentle but strong, emotional but controlled. People at nearby tables slowly turned in their chairs. Forks were set down. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. She was no longer thinking about the room. She was not thinking about the wealthy man or his laughter. She was thinking about the music itself, about the way the notes rose and fell, about the feeling in her chest as the melody grew deeper. Her shoulders relaxed, her back straightened. She did not look like a nervous waitress anymore. She looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. The wealthy man leaned forward slightly in his chair. His expression changed from amusement to confusion. One of his guests whispered, "She's actually very good." Very good was an understatement. The piece she was playing was not simple. It required timing and skill. It required focus. Her fingers moved quickly now, yet every note was clear. The music filled every corner of the restaurant. In the back of the room, an older gentleman who had been quietly eating alone slowly removed his glasses. He stared at her hands carefully. There was recognition in his eyes. The melody shifted into something more powerful. The soft beginning grew into a strong wave of sound. It was the kind of music that made people feel something without knowing exactly why. A woman near the window placed her hand over her heart. The wealthy man's smile had completely disappeared now. He looked around, noticing that no one was paying attention to him anymore. All eyes were on the piano. The waitress did not rush. She let the music breathe. She let the pauses speak just as loudly as the notes. As she played, memories flowed through her mind. Long nights practicing under a small lamp. Her teacher correcting her posture gently. Applause from small recital halls. The proud smile on her father's face when she finished a difficult piece without mistakes. For a moment, it felt like those years had returned. The piece reached its most powerful part. Her fingers moved with speed now, crossing over each other smoothly. The sound was rich and full, carried confidence. One of the wealthy man's guests sat back slowly in his chair, clearly impressed. Another guest nodded softly, as if understanding something important. The older gentleman in the back stood up quietly and walked a few steps closer, still listening carefully. The restaurant manager watched from near the kitchen door. His face showed surprise but also pride. The wealthy man shifted uncomfortably. He had wanted a show. He had wanted to laugh. Instead, he was witnessing something he did not expect. Something real. As the final section approached, the music softened again. The strong notes gave way to something gentle and reflective. Felt like the closing of a story. Her hands slowed. The last note lingered in the air for a few seconds before fading completely. Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Not empty silence. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are moved and do not know how to react right away. Then, from somewhere near the back, someone began to clap. It was the older gentleman. The sound of his hands came slowly at first, then stronger. One by one, others joined in. Soon the entire restaurant was filled with applause. The waitress stood up from the bench, slightly surprised by the reaction. She gave a small, humble nod. Her cheeks turned warm, but this time it was not from embarrassment. It was from something else. The wealthy man remained seated. His hands rested on the table. He did not clap right away. His guests, however, were clapping openly now. The older gentleman stepped forward. "That was beautifully played," he said sincerely. She smiled softly. "Thank you." "Where did you train?" he asked. She hesitated for a second, not out of shame, but because she had not spoken about that part of her life in a long time. "At a conservatory in the city," she said simply. The gentleman nodded slowly, as if that confirmed what he had already guessed. "I could tell," he replied. "You have strong technique. And heart." She lowered her eyes modestly. "I haven't practiced in a while," she admitted. "Talent like that doesn't disappear," he said gently. At the table in the center of the room, the wealthy man finally stood up. His face was serious now. He cleared his throat. "Well," he said, forcing a small smile, "I suppose I underestimated you." The words sounded awkward in the quiet room. She looked at him calmly. There was no anger in her expression. No pride either. Just calm understanding. "It's all right," she said. But the room felt different now. People were no longer looking at her as just a waitress. They were looking at her as an artist, as someone with depth and discipline. The wealthy man noticed the shift. He noticed how his guests looked at her with respect. He noticed how they were no longer laughing at his jokes. For the first time that evening, he seemed unsure of himself. One of his guests turned to him and said quietly, "You never know someone's full story." The words were not harsh, but they carried weight. The waitress stepped away from the piano slowly. She picked up her apron from the counter and tied it back around her waist. The simple act showed something powerful. She was not trying to prove she was better than anyone. She was simply returning to her work. As she walked back toward the tables, several guests stopped her to offer kind words. Some thanked her for the music. Others simply smiled warmly. The wealthy man sat down again, but his posture had changed. He no longer leaned back with confidence. He sat quietly, thinking. Dinner continued, but the mood was softer now. The loud bragging did not return. The conversation became more balanced, more respectful, and in the corner of the room, the grand piano no longer looked forgotten. It had reminded everyone of something important, that talent can exist in quiet places, that dignity does not need a spotlight, and that sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who teaches you the biggest lesson. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling in the room did not disappear. It stayed there, warm and steady, like the echo of the last piano note. The waitress returned to her work as if nothing unusual had happened. She picked up a tray, checked on another table, and asked if anyone needed more water. But everything had changed. People looked at her differently now. Not with pity, not with superiority. They looked at her with respect. At the wealthy man's table, the atmosphere was no longer loud and proud. His guests were speaking in softer voices. One of them kept glancing toward the piano, still processing what they had just heard. The wealthy man cleared his throat and tried to bring the attention back to himself. "Well," he said, forcing a small laugh, "that was unexpected." No one responded the way they had earlier in the evening. One guest finally said, "It was more than unexpected. It was impressive." The wealthy man nodded quickly. Yes, of course. Impressive for someone who doesn't even play professionally anymore." The words were meant to reduce the moment, but they sounded weak. Across the room, the older gentleman who had spoken to her earlier was still standing near the piano. He was deep in thought. After a moment, he walked toward the manager. "You have a rare talent working here," he said quietly. The manager smiled. "I had no idea she could play like that. I used to teach at a conservatory," the gentleman continued. "I've heard many students. She has discipline and emotion. That combination is not common." The manager looked surprised. "Really?" The gentleman nodded. "She shouldn't let that gift stay hidden." Meanwhile, the waitress carried a fresh pot of coffee to another table. Her hands were steady, but inside, her heart was still racing. Playing again after so long had stirred something deep inside her. It reminded her of who she was before life became heavy with responsibility. As she poured coffee, a woman at the table touched her hand gently. "Thank you for the music," she said softly. "It was beautiful." The waitress smiled, feeling a mix of gratitude and emotion. "Thank you for listening," she replied. Back at the center table, one of the guests turned to the wealthy man. "You never mentioned that your dinners come with live performances," he said lightly. The wealthy man forced a smile. "I didn't plan it," he replied. "Sometimes the best moments aren't planned," another guest added. There was meaning in his words. Dessert plates were cleared away. The evening was coming to an end. The wealthy man signaled for the bill, eager to regain control of the situation. When the waitress brought the check, he looked up at her differently this time. There was less arrogance in his eyes, though his pride still stood tall. "You surprised us," he said. She nodded politely. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Why aren't you on a stage somewhere?" It was not asked as an insult this time. She answered honestly. "My family needed me, so I chose to work." He studied her face, trying to understand. For the first time that night, he seemed to see her as a person, not just a role. "That must have been difficult," one of his guests said quietly. She gave a small shrug. "Sometimes we do what we have to do." The wealthy man signed the bill without another joke. He stood up from the table and adjusted his jacket. His confidence was not gone, but it was quieter now. As he prepared to leave, the older gentleman approached again. "Excuse me," he said to the waitress. "May I speak with you for a moment?" She looked at the manager, who nodded in approval. "Of course," she replied. They stepped a little aside from the crowd. "I meant what I said," the gentleman began. "You have real training. I could hear it in your touch." She felt a small wave of emotion. "I haven't played in front of people in a long time," she admitted. "That doesn't matter," he said. "Skill like yours doesn't disappear. It waits." His words stayed with her. "If you ever consider returning to music," he continued, "I would be happy to guide you, even introduce you to some people." There are opportunities for performers who are serious about their craft. She was silent for a moment. Opportunities. That word felt distant, almost unreal. Thank you, she said sincerely. That means a lot. He handed her a small card. Think about it. Don't let fear decide for you. Across the room, the wealthy man watched the conversation. He felt something he had not expected to feel that night. Regret. He walked toward her slowly. His guests followed a few steps behind. I may have been harsh earlier, he said, choosing his words carefully. I tend to speak without thinking. The apology was not perfect. It was not dramatic, but it was real enough. She met his eyes calmly. It's all right, she said again. No, he replied quietly. It's not. I shouldn't judge people by what I see at first glance. His guests stood silently, surprised by his tone. She nodded, accepting his words without making a scene. She did not need revenge. She did not need to embarrass him in return. The music had already spoken for her. One of the guests extended his hand to her. Thank you for tonight, he said warmly. It was memorable. Another guest added, You reminded us that success comes in many forms. The wealthy man looked around the restaurant one last time. The spotlight he had tried to create for himself earlier now felt small compared to what had just happened. He reached into his wallet and placed something on the table. It was more than a standard tip. It was generous. But money was not the real change that evening. As the group walked toward the exit, the wealthy man paused near the piano. He ran his fingers lightly along its polished surface, then glanced back at her. Don't stop playing, he said quietly. She watched them leave. When the door closed behind them, the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations picked up again. Dishes clinked softly. The night continued. But for her, something had shifted. Later, during a short break, she sat alone at a small table near the window. She looked at the card the older gentleman had given her. His name and contact information were printed neatly on it. She traced the edge of the card with her thumb. For so long, she had convinced herself that music was a closed chapter. Something beautiful but finished. Tonight had shown her that it was still alive inside her. The manager approached and sat across from her. I'm proud of you, he said simply. She smiled. Thank you for letting me play. You didn't just play, he replied. You changed the whole room. She looked down, feeling both shy and strong at the same time. Whatever you decide to do, he continued, know that you deserve more than being looked down on. His words meant more than he realized. When her shift ended, she walked past the piano one more time. She stopped and gently pressed a single key. The note rang out softly in the empty space. This time it didn't feel like a goodbye. Felt like a beginning. The next morning did not feel ordinary. She woke up before her alarm rang, her mind already replaying the night before. For a few seconds, she wondered if it had been a dream. The quiet restaurant, the piano keys under her fingers, the applause. Then she saw the small card resting on her bedside table. It was real. She sat up slowly and held the card again. The older gentleman's name was printed clearly, along with a phone number and an email address. He had spoken with calm confidence, the kind that comes from years of experience. He had not offered empty praise. He had spoken with certainty. Still, doubt tried to creep in. It had been months since she practiced seriously. Maybe even longer. Life had been full of responsibilities. Hospital visits, bills, double shifts. Music had slowly become something she carried quietly in her heart instead of something she lived every day. She placed the card back on the table and got ready for work. When she arrived at the restaurant that afternoon, the atmosphere felt lighter. A few coworkers smiled at her in a different way. Word had spread about what happened the night before. I saw the video, one server said softly as they prepared silverware. She looked up. Video? Someone recorded a small part of it, the server explained. It's going around online. Her heart skipped. Is it bad? No. The server laughed gently. It's amazing. People are commenting about how beautiful it sounded. She did not know how to react. The idea that strangers were hearing her play felt strange, personal, but it also felt like a door opening. Later that evening, the manager called her into his office. "Don't worry," he said with a smile. "You're not in trouble." She let out a small breath. "I just wanted to tell you something," he continued. "Since last night, a few customers have asked if you'll be playing again this weekend." She blinked. "Playing? Yes. We usually hire musicians on Saturdays. But if you're willing, we'd rather have you. Of course, you would be paid for it." The idea felt both exciting and frightening. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "It's been a long time since I performed regularly." The manager leaned back in his chair. "You didn't look unsure last night." She thought about that. He was right. When she sat at the piano, something inside her had felt steady. "You don't have to decide now," he said kindly. "Just think about it." That evening, as she finished her shift, she stayed behind for a few extra minutes. The restaurant was nearly empty. The piano stood quietly in the corner again. She walked toward it slowly. Her fingers hovered over the keys before she pressed down gently. A soft melody filled the space. Not loud, not dramatic, just simple notes flowing together. She played for herself this time. No audience, no pressure, just memory and feeling. After a few minutes, she stopped and reached for her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed the number on the card. It rang twice before the older gentleman answered. "Hello, it's me," she said, suddenly nervous. "From the restaurant last night." His voice warmed immediately. "I was hoping you would call." They spoke for almost half an hour. He asked about her training, about where she had studied, about why she stopped. She answered honestly. She did not hide the difficult parts. "Life can pause dreams," he said gently, "but it doesn't erase them." He told her about a small recital event happening in a few weeks. It was not a huge stage, not a grand concert hall, but it was real. Musicians from different backgrounds would perform. "I think you should consider it," he said. "You're ready." Ready. The word echoed in her mind long after the call ended. Over the next few days, she began waking up earlier. Before work, she practiced at a small community center nearby that allowed her to use their piano during quiet hours. At first, her fingers felt stiff. Some pieces were harder than she remembered, but slowly the rhythm returned. Each morning practice gave her a sense of calm she had not felt in years. Even on long shifts, she felt lighter knowing that music was becoming part of her daily life again. At the restaurant, customers continued asking about her performance. Some even requested specific pieces for the weekend. When Saturday arrived, she stood behind the curtain near the piano, feeling nervous but determined. The restaurant was full. This time she was not being challenged. She was being invited. The manager stepped forward and made a simple announcement. "Tonight, we have a special performance by someone very talented from our own team." Applause filled the room as she walked toward the piano. Her heart beat fast, but it was not fear. It was anticipation. She sat down and began to play. The music flowed stronger than before. There was confidence in every note. She was not proving anything to anyone now. She was sharing something meaningful. Guests closed their eyes. Conversations softened. The atmosphere felt different from any other night at the restaurant. When she finished, the applause was immediate and warm. Among the audience, she noticed a familiar face. The wealthy man was sitting at a table near the back. He was alone this time. He stood and clapped like everyone else. There was no smirk, no sarcasm. After the performance, he approached her quietly. "I heard you were playing tonight," he said. She nodded politely. "I wanted to say something properly," he continued. "Last time, I spoke without understanding. I judged too quickly." She studied his expression. It was sincere. "Thank you," she replied calmly. He looked around the room. "You belong up there," he said, nodding toward the piano. "Not because of pride, but because you have something rare." She did not know what to say. She simply smiled. Before leaving, he added, "I hope you keep going." As he walked away, she realized something important. The night he mocked her had felt painful, but it had also pushed her toward something she might have continued ignoring. Sometimes, even difficult moments can become turning points. Later that evening, she received a message from the older gentleman. "I heard about tonight." It read, "You're already moving forward." She looked at the message and felt a quiet strength settle inside her. The recital was only weeks away now. For the first time in a long time, she was not just surviving each day. She was building something again. And this time, she was not hiding who she truly was.